Hi, I'm Gabe. I'm designing tabletop role-playing games, and today I wanted to talk about a project that I have that's in progress. So this is a game that I actually started developing in November of 2024, and it is now September of 2025. I've worked on this a lot in my spare time, although there are other projects as well that I've been thinking about or working on in different levels. And I have noticed as a relatively new designer myself how difficult it is to access the creative process of people who are doing the thing that you want to do. And so I thought it might be helpful to other new designers to see mine or at least get some reflection on how I got to where I am now and where I'm planning on going with this from here. And we're gonna just see what that's like. So thinking in public is what we're doing. Not gonna be the cleanest recording, I'm sure, but hopefully it's useful. This game, You Thievin Goblins, is a game where you all playing a group of goblins going somewhere they don't belong to get something they obsessively want and to get in, get out, and don't get caught. This is meant to be a game that you can play with your friends with no prep. Um, Hopefully someone reads the rules, but other than that, and they're pretty short rules. This is literally a two-page document. One page is focused on pernicious creatures, that is, player characters, and then the other page is about the Goblin Manager or Game Master. I'm pretty proud of it so far, but it is a silly game. I frankly, most of the designs I do are far more complicated and like abstract and heavy. But this was something that I felt like I can get this done quickly, which was maybe a mistake in thinking. I did get an initial draft done in like a couple days back in November of 2024, and then have been iterating and iterating on it since then. So the way that this whole project got started actually is in this third column of the player characters. It is this small treasures idea. I had been playing and thinking about Breath of the Wild and how interesting a mechanic it is to be forced to use new tools, that you can't rely on the same thing all the time. And so, with that in mind, as I was building out this game, I really wanted to make sure that there were ways to both uh, get new items quickly, break old items, and also to combine items, which is this section here. So I'm I started there and then kind of had to, well, who would be in the situation that they're having all of these items break? That led to thinking about goblins. I had been thinking about the phrase goblin mode as well as like a kind of jumping off point. And so the pernicious creatures section for sure is where I started. I, in the first iteration of this, had not a super detailed goblin manager thing. I ran it myself for my parents, and in the process realized that I had not given myself enough support to run this without prep, and therefore that's how we end up with like the tension system, which ends up in this whole block and these trackers and everything. Um, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Back up and let's just talk through each section of this game as it came about. With this game, I knew that having breaking items, I didn't want it to be frustrating. And I think part of what makes a game like Breath of the Wild's durability mechanics somewhat frustrating at times is the kind of self-seriousness of the game at times. Uh, Whereas, like, if I'm just fighting a bunch of bokoblins out in the middle of nowhere in this stupid little camp that they have, and oh, I need to, like, pull out a twig or whatever and start hitting somebody with it, that doesn't bother me as much. But if I am going up against a boss and I have like a cool sword that I got and now I'm like worried about the sword breaking, that becomes significantly more stressful. And so there is really important element in my mind of this tone setting, of you playing goblins and having the tone inspiration, as I put here, of this is a Looney Tunes, the Owl House, Ah Real Monsters style. Even, the Owl House is probably the most serious of all of them, but they all have goofiness, and you're not too worried about any of the characters um, getting hurt in any real way. And from there, we're able to really move on. A big reason why I actually added these illustrations, which I did all of the illustrations that are in this. That's not a skill everybody has, I know that, but if you can, it's helpful, right? Um, the goal with these illustrations was to evoke that cartoony style. That I wanted this to be, you are a bunch of weird, silly guys. You can define goblin in all of these different ways and more. From there, let's really get into the core mechanic. Doing stuff is what I called it, in part to have a more silly name instead of like how to do an action or whatever you're used to with big elephant in the room games. So with all of this, I have this idea, okay, there's obstacles in the game. We're going to be really like scene based in this. So what are people doing? You have a pool of d6s. This was in part so that people who don't necessarily have the whole set of D&D-esque dice uh, are going to be able to still play this. Like, as long as you have a few dice, you can probably figure this out. So you start with a single die. No matter what happens, you always have a chance of success. Then you have a related adjective, as we'll get into later, of your goblin. Then you may have a title, as again we'll get into later. And then you might have items, these small treasures that can apply. Now, as you can see, this is the first one that has an S, right? This is a related adjective, one per roll. A title, one per roll. But small treasures, you can add a bunch of these, or at least, well, you'll see later, but two of these. And you can also help each other. I always think this is an important mechanic to incentivize that kind of behavior, which is more fun in general, especially for a game like this. And then if the antagonists, their alertness or confidence benefits you, then that also adds into this. And then this last line, the GM laughing or being impressed, this was something that I thought of pretty early on as like, again, what is the kind of game this is? This is a game about a group of friends playing together. The GM is playing a different role, but they're still involved and they're still, as you can see here, if the GM laughs and was impressed and that's what gives you benefits, they are much more on your side than they might otherwise appear to be. Now, then we have the results. I tried to fit this into a basic framework that we'll see multiple times here of having a kind of evocative short phrase or title, um, and then the rules description of that thing. So here we have like a 1 to 2, that's a failure, right? Clang, bad goblin, what keeps you from continuing down this path? That was an important part too, because I don't want you to just be repeating the same issues over and over again um, with the same tactic. That's a core thing of this is to not get that bogged down, boring feel. And then also there's a benefit to the GM who gets these points that they're able to spend on negative consequences for the players. Um, 3 to 4 is a mixed success. This is a system, obviously, that I'm sure many of you have seen before in lots of games of this like failure, mixed success, total success system. So here we have, haha, oh gobs. Um, this is a success, but the GM still gets some sort of benefit. 5 to 6, Goblin, yes, good win, uh, is a success, but it's kind of like, this is frankly the most boring outcome. Um, and I do think it is important to kind of sometimes just let things move forward, but Then we start to see these kind of more interesting, greater versions of success. We have we have two sixes, um, double exclamation point to really drive home the point that it's important, and then you get a title. So this is the first instance of this, and it shows you, do other goblins award you with? So we're bringing back in the other players at this point. Um, I'll get into titles in a second, but then we have this secondary step. If you have more than two sixes, not only do you get a title, but you also get to do these other things. So then uh, you can either allow another goblin to do stuff before the GM can spend any tension. Again, we'll get into that, but basically, before any consequences can happen. Or if, say, you've run out of obstacles, this can allow you to store a die for the future. This can repeat, so the more dice you're rolling, the higher the chances of this kind of extreme success. And so, yeah, there's this incentive to like really try to push your luck on getting these. Then I did want to allow, I like allowing players to have options once they have faced or have a consequence that they are now facing. So here we have escaping the consequence. There is this much more story-based one of indulging a vice. How do you accidentally negate the consequences by indulging this vice? But at the same time, it makes the future more difficult with this negative d6. You can also sacrifice two small treasures. This wipes your toolkit, but it's not that hard to gain more toolkit, so you can escape with some regularity. Now, making your goblin. Um, this was also a part I really wanted to. This description is actually really important because there's a lot of cultural hmm, negative association at times with goblins. Goblins have been used as a stand-in for a lot of different actual real life races, describing, whether it was the Irish or the Jews as mischievous little creatures that are also kind of dumb, and that's not cool. On the other hand, people clearly like goblins. There is something that is really enjoyable about like thinking about these little guys. And it doesn't have to be associated with those much more like heavy and problematic usages that we have gotten into at times in the real world. And we know people like this goblin idea, and because of the phrase goblin mode, right? This is something that people talk about. Like, I want to be that sometimes. I want to not care about long term thinking, just enjoy my hedonism and be in my bed or eating a bunch of chips and getting it messy all over the couch. That is an enjoyable experience, and goblins can sometimes allow people to be that way if they are playing role playing as them. Okay, so we've got this description, therefore, that is meant to evoke that kind of goblin, not the much more problematic, like, what would goblins be in real life type. So here we are. You are a folkloric warning against hubris, a mischievous spirit, karma incarnate, a malevolent manifestation. You are not really a person in this way. But then in play, you are just a clumsy little guy, a perpetual underdog who it is an embarrassment to even conflict with. Again, you are karma incarnate. There is an aspect to your character that is about punishing people for the sin of hubris. From there, adjectives. Um, this is the question is, what makes your goblin unique? Why do they think they are the best goblin? I also wanted to include this kind of language of like how your character thinks about themselves to get players thinking. Um, and again, to drive home this tone as many times as possible throughout the rules. So when this trait is relevant to what you are trying to do, you are better at it. Um, I am encouraging making up your own, but I also have a list in case that is difficult for any particular player, um, just to get them started. I actually changed this language in the last change to this that I made on the third, based on a friend of mine who was reading through this and noted that I was suggesting the list first and then saying you can make up your own, and that de-emphasized the creativity. And so in switching this, I am hoping that it encourages the creativity first, but then provides a safety net. So then we have names. This is not mechanically important at all, but it's fun. So what do goblins call you? Make up a name or generate a name in one of these ways. So I provide a couple different options, something fun to say, just straight up like gobbledygook, bungle, snickersnack, don't mind if I do. Something that's just crass, booger, bunghole, fartlick. Fartlick is not actually crass, but it sounds crass, so it works. And then something onomatopoetic and gross. So you could just be or pipt or squelch, right? Now, titles is in here because it kind of fits into this who is your goblin section, even if you don't get it at character creation, as I point out. So this is a thing that I also wanted to really encourage of like a kind of uh, if you've read or listened to a playthrough of Roll for Shoes, this is kind of based on that, of this idea of like, oh, when you succeed drastically, you get even better and you get into this kind of like exploding chaos of just being able to do insane things. So with this, it's a little bit made less crazy by having these more and more specific titles that are weird and only relate to very specific things. So particularly whatever you did to earn this. Um, so here we go. We've got some examples. These are not like adjectives that are just like cackling, but are things like a snuffler of candy, long fingers. So this would be something like booger long fingers, or don't mind if I do, the Goose Rider, that kind of thing. Um, and you can have multiple titles. I went back and forth on like allowing you to also have multiple adjectives. Um, I think in the experiment so far that having it be the titles that are these confidence boosters basically um, is an easier sell as opposed to this idea that your goblin was like gooey, but now you also get to make up an adjective that has some other thing. Just keeps the goblin as like a concept a little bit more solidified. We already talked a decent amount about small treasures, but specifically, I wanted to force you to be creative. You can't just be like, oh, I want to have like an awesome tool to start. Like, I don't want to, like, I want a 10-foot pole or whatever. And in this case, the way that we limit that is by saying, why would big folk overlook this item if it went missing? So again, I make up your own or pick roll from this list. Pot missing a handle, roughly plucked feather, holy sock, i.e. it has a hole in it, rotten fish head on a hook, pretty good stick, and leaky flask of something. So all of these are trash, basically. They're things that someone probably has on a table and is like, oh, I'm gonna either like fix that at some point, or it's just gonna sit there for a week and then I have to throw it out. Another limitation that this one actually is me replicating, I think it's Trash Pandas. I'm not going to bother looking it up right now, but it's a Grant Howitt piece. And if you don't know Grant Howitt, definitely look up their work. They're great. Their stuff is just so creative and wackadoo. But this idea of goblins can only carry two small treasures because they have two hands. A really simple limiter that is pretty intuitive. And then with this next line, the biggest small treasure a goblin can carry is one they can comedically waddle around with. That is what this image came from, was this desire to be like, I'm gonna make this biggest small treasure thing of comedically waddling around with. Let's give that a little image. It's already got a little bit of it with this language, but I think this fits well with the entire section of small treasures and then also drives home. So um, you can give treasures to each other freely. So again, that creativity mindset of like, oh, wait a second, I have this thing. If we put that with this, blah, 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 blah. And you may also find one small treasure per scene. This one has been, this one has changed a lot. Whether it was like an action, like doing stuff, like you would do stuff to get something, or you could only get it at the beginning of the scene. Right now, I'm trying to kind of, again, back out of this difficulty mindset of like, oh, it can't be that easy to get new stuff. And instead try and like make it as easy and fun as possible to do the thing that I really want you to do of finding new stuff and using new stuff and breaking that stuff and not really caring about it. Um, I do not want you to be precious with these items. So then we get into maybe the core of this, which is durability. Any item, when used by goblins, is prone to breaking. That is the logic for why you can have, I don't know, whatever a goblin finds anywhere in the world, keep breaking no matter what it is. And yes, you could have picked up like a helmet, like an armored helmet, but it's still gonna break because you are a goblin, and that is the nature of how things operate in your vicinity. So, all items have 2 dots of durability. This is an abstract, but sometimes you gotta get there. If you use an item when doing stuff, a dot of durability is risked. So, um, again, this has changed a lot, but after seeing the result of your doing stuff roll, you may choose to crack 2 remaining dots of durability, i.e., if you were starting with an item, you can just break it. If you do, you add another d6 to your doing stuff roll. So this durability mechanic has changed a good deal. There used to be a whole thing in here of like using the dice chain of like a D4 to a D6 to a D8 to a D10 to a D12 to a D20. Um, and I cut that entirely because it was just too much on top of this, and it also made it more difficult for that like, oh, anybody, we can just play this in an evening no matter what idea. That was kind of a core tenet of like how I wanted this game to work. So we end up with these durability dots that we can gain more of by combining items. So you can smush, tape together, or otherwise crassly combine 2 items into one even more special item. You don't need a roll for it, but you can only do it once per scene. So what does your goblin name their creation? Again, inviting that creativity, inviting the players to take this mechanical thing and bring it back into the world of their character. Um, the new item has the number of dots that the 2 original items had remaining combined +1. So if you combine 2 items that were have not been used yet, you now have 5 dots of durability to work with, which is maybe two. Um, this is something in particular that I want to play test, see what happens. Might be overpowered, but that is what playtests were for. As I said, this changed from the last playtest because it was too much just bookkeeping and everything. Like, oh, what kind of die is it now? Blah 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 blah. Um, to the point that the players that I was having, my parents again, who are not like experienced role players but have done it like once with me, um, they were avoiding this mechanic entirely because it was too complicated. So that's a good sign to like back off in my mind. Goblin Manager. So this section is definitely the thing that has had the most work done on it since that initial draft I made of this game way back in November of 2024. The things that were there from the beginning was this idea of how do you create a heist? I wanted to make this quick. There's just a couple questions in here that you fill out. They're not even questions, they're Mad Lib style sentences. Shout out to the Splatbook podcast and the John Corey's Mad Libs style game that he runs, because that was the impetus for this as well. The first thing that I feel pretty good about is this idea of the location where you roll 2d6 and you fill in this sentence. It's a blank that once was a blank. So it's a cozy cottage that used to be a big old tree. Um, the in the playtest that I did, it was a roadside inn that used to be a big old tree. So the idea here is it immediately gives a little bit more character than any one of these would have on its own. Why is there a roadside inn in a big old tree? What kind of people would be running an inn in a big old tree? Does that give it kind of like a fae vibe where, like, are the denizens of this actually like the archfey who are interacting with mortals or something along those lines? Or, a wizard's tower that used to be an imposing galleon, there's a wizard who used to be a pirate? Like, what is going on here? But it adds this interesting element that can kind of kickstart some creativity there. Then we have a goal. So roll a d6, fill in this sentence, get the blank, and escape. So that could be food, weapon, toy, something shiny, something fancy, or literally trash. Um, then I do have a note actually up here that with all of these, it should become a specific example of that kind of thing. So it's not just whatever you find in the place that's shiny. It's like a specific necklace or whatever. So from there, we have very important sentence again fitting into this idea of getting that question to be asked of the players that ties a rule or something else back into the world and tied it back into their characters. So why do the goblins incorrectly think it's valuable? Um, so yeah, why do they think it's valuable and they're wrong about it? Again, adding a little bit more of that comedic humor to it. Um, and then antagonists. So both the goblins and their antagonists are goofy idiots. But the antagonists think they are better than the goblins, and that is the key to their failure. Their hubris requires a comeuppance, and that is why you are here. So, again, think that Looney Tunes-esque thing, like Daffy Duck being hunted by Elmer Fudd. Daffy Duck is an idiot, but so is Elmer Fudd, and Elmer Fudd thinks that he is better than Daffy Duck, so any bad thing that happens to him is something he deserves in the like world of Looney Tunes. Then, so how do you pick the antagonist? We have two sentences here that are slightly different. One is told to the PCs, one is only for the GM. So, told to the PCs, the biggest threat seems to be a guardian. To yourself only, the biggest threat seems to be a guardian, but in reality, it's the nemesis, basically. So again, we have a pick six uh, list: mythical beast, nosy old neighbor, curious pet, precocious child, overly loyal worker, or a separate faction. So the idea here, again, is that, oh, we're bringing two weird things and saying these two things are inextricably related to each other, the guardian and the nemesis, right? And so it could be that it's, the guardian that seems really horrifying, and then the nemesis is like, a nosy old neighbor. Or it could be the flip, where it turns out that there's some horrible thing that is way more difficult than whatever they thought they were going to be dealing with. Either situation can be very fun. Um, I really liked this separate faction one in particular, but it was so hard to figure out how to word it. Um, a lot of this I had to massage the wording just because of the amount of space. Because a very limited amount of space in this. Because I was like, I want this to be able to be something you print on a page of paper. Um, I kind of cheated by having the Goblin Manager be on the back of that sheet of paper, but what are you gonna do? Um, and then this is something that I don't know if I feel great about, but I was just like, pick appropriate mooks. Um, they should be indistinguishable, incompetent minions, lazy guards, moldy skeletons, cleaning staff, etc. Um, that would be presumably the minions of the Nemesis, which the players don't know, or the Guardian, which they do. So this can be a clue for the players, depending on how you as a GM figure this out. And then, why do the antagonists deserve this? So this is a little repetitive of their hubris requires comeuppance, but it now that you've had like this is an introduction to the idea of the kind of antagonist we're thinking about, and then this is an actual decision. Why do the antagonists deserve this? Running the heist. I actually started with this section on the scenes, but I realized that again, if you have players that are used to like super dangerous D&D dungeons and like are going to be poking everything with a 10-foot pole and like might just be outside the venue scoping it out for like 2 days. No, we're not doing that. Um, this is inspired by Blades in the Dark. Um, to begin, the PCs propose what the first obstacle was to entering the location. The PC who most recently watched a slapstick rolls a d6 for how well the PCs did crossing the first threshold to the location. So we have a thing that I love of like, how do you pick the first player that evokes the concept of the game? That's something that you see a lot in board games these days, and I love it. And so here, again, we're like forcing you to think about slapstick and getting that in your mind as you keep going. So, uh, the GM gets tension points equal to 4 minus half the die result. I don't love that. It's just like a little bit overly complicated wording, but I think it gets the idea across. Um, and then there is no turning back now. So you can't go back. You've passed the first obstacle. You are in the location. Um, in the original like idea of how this was going to work, I was thinking there would be like phases of like, oh, you're outside the location. How do you get past that? And then, oh, you're like closer to the treasure or whatever you're getting, and like that has a different kind of thing. And then, oh, you've escaped. And again, trying to simplify where possible when it like wasn't making it harder for a GM to run. That was like the big tension is for this like how do we keep this simple? How do we keep this in 2 pages when simultaneously uh we want to make this easy to run, something that like any GM who's new to this is probably going to be okay. Um, so got rid of like the very prescribed, like you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and went instead with this idea of like, I'm going to give you some basic tenets. So probably takes 3 to 5 scenes to get to the goal, 1 to 3 to get to escape. Originally I had a whole thing of like, oh, if it's dragging, do shorter. I think it's clear to the players for the GM who's doing this, but you start a scene, it has 2 obstacles that are both threatening the PC. Um, so there's a PC phase and there's a GM phase. PCs, they decide the obstacles each of their characters are focused on. Each PC may lead or uh, this could be phrased maybe a little bit differently. Lead or help with 1 role per PC phase. If there are only 2 players, I say and, so you can both lead and help. That's just kind of like trying to massage the like probability in this. Um, so anyway, all roll doing stuff simultaneously. If multiple PCs succeed on the same obstacle, the PC with the top result snatches victory from the others. This was one, a way to not have too much happen on like insane rolls. Um, where like I didn't want it to be something where like, oh, everybody freaking succeeded, and now like the whole game is over for one scene because you just rolled really well. But with this idea of the if they are rolling on the same obstacle, the PC with the top result snatches victory from the others. This leads to like what I think is an evocative to this kind of story thing of the goblin being like one goblin grabbing the thing and feeling superior, and then another one like coming out of nowhere and taking the thing from them, um, or passing the thing or whatever obstacle you've got going on. Um, then we have a GM phase. The GM may buy consequences on the table below, with tension points. They then describe how the scene has changed due to that. But if there's no more obstacles after those consequences, then you move to the next scene. So otherwise, you enter a new PC phase. Hope that's relatively clear. And then I provide some obstacle examples. The place itself, rotten rafters, there's a blood carnival, shag rug. This, as you might kind of see in this, like different descriptions, we have a kind of more normal thing in the first. So rotten rafters, mook, green flame, all classic things from basic fantasy. And then a weirder thing, um, Blood Carnival, Chatty Painting, Fizzy Portal, and then a different kind of weird in a different way. So Shag Rug, Hungry Brain Rats, Loose Spell. I have an idea of what loose spell means, but you might have a different one. So again, these like evocative in as few words as possible. I also have some tips and guidance, especially for those who are first timers. Um, your goal is to challenge, not beat the PCs. You're all on the same side of having fun this evening. Follow the dice. If as anything works, that's great. Um, and then overrule if it's unfun for anyone, um, with a no but. So again, it's just like condensing so much stuff about how to be a good GM into like, I don't know, 20 words or something. Um, the overrule if unfun for anyone, I hope the GM realizes that anyone includes them. Um, but space. Um, and yeah, just trying to like encourage the goblin manager to roll with whatever happens unless it's going to be bad for someone, unless someone's going to have a bad time. Tension. This is the absolute core of what I have been working on for like since March, something like that. On and off, obviously, but um, this whole thing is just a guide. Yeah, this thing that takes up like, I don't know, a third of the page is a guide you could completely throw out if you are a really experienced GM. That's kind of true of every rule, I guess, in a game. But the idea here, this is something actually, man, okay, just name dropping. So like this is definitely inspired by the MCDM RPG, or Draw Steel, as I think it is now called, um, that had basically a little game for the GM to do that was like had a little bit more crunch to it, had a little bit more advice kind of built into what you could do. Uh, to mess with players, and built into that, guidance on when to. So uh, you get a point of tension at the beginning of every scene. Once the PCs have their goal, that is, they have something shiny or whatever it is, you get 2 points of tension. So things get more difficult, just inherently. You also get a point of tension for each one rolled in doing stuff. Not if one is the highest number, but just one in general. So if they are playing with like trying to succeed as much as possible, they're probably going to try to get their adjective and the title and the small treasure and everything, which will mean they'll roll a lot of dice, which will be more likely to succeed, but it also means they're more likely to have consequences. Um, so, hoping that's a bit of elegant game design, it feels that way. Um, and then for each consequence you buy, step up an antagonist track. So you are playing a little bit of a game here of like trying to beat your own clock. Once an antagonist is defeated, they are out of play. If your consequence that you want is only a point away, like you have 3 points and you need 4 points in order to do something, you can make it cost one less if you do one of these options. Again, trying to provide that a means of flexibility um, that you can take advantage of, but there are consequences. So risk reward stuff all over the place as much as possible. Uh, so yeah, you have public panic. All the PCs get a +1d6 for doing stuff in the next scene. Um, if it's the last thing I do is another one of these like titles to evocative titles, an antagonist steps up to desperate. We'll see in the track below, and then PCs propose a weakness of an antagonist when it applies +2d6 to doing stuff. I'm gonna skip this for a second and go down to this tracker. Um, this was again something that I was trying to. This went through so many iterations. But I came to the idea of like there is the antagonist becoming alert and then getting more and more frustrated by the fact that they're not succeeding against these embarrassing little goblin creatures. Um, and then they eventually become defeated. Kind of classic Disney villain stuff here too, of like, I think in particular of like Gaston. He's oblivious to the beast or whatever, and super, super confident. Once he realizes that there's a fight, he's very confident and alert. Then he gets frustrated. Then he becomes desperate. Eventually, he, falls off a castle to theoretically die, but is stated off screen. Anyway, um, so with this here, we also have these locks. So you can only step up one thing, and then you can start stepping up more different things. You have more and more choices as the game goes on. Playtesting is gonna happen, but we'll see. Again, this is new, so uh, really, really hoping this works. Um, I could easily see a lot of this falling apart just due to like math. That I haven't like math is hard. Probability is hard, especially with this many random rolls and stuff and decisions that you can make. But you know, you practice, try things out, see if they work. Um, I'm not too worried about it because I think there's some pretty easy ways to massage those because they're just the numbers aspects. But the core design is having these costs. There's a requirement or not, and then the consequence that you're buying. So the cheapest ones, thick skull, crack a dot of durability, and a small treasure. So this is dang, I think I had something here. The small treasure that was used um in in this role or whatever. Um Shoot. And then what was that? Step up an antagonist track. Uh, this is an interesting one because why would you want to do that? Um, it is your lose condition. If we, oh my God, scroll up, um, we can see that like you step up an antagonist track, then that can be bad. However, it also can give you more options, right? So if you go from have your mooks and they're suspicious and you really want to like get to some of these later things, you can just make someone step up twice, basically. That's a choice you can make. Um, then we have this that was attached. You can add an obstacle to the next scene. Just drop 2 points, and there's going to be 3 obstacles in the next scene instead of two. Another, you can make it not so easy. Pick one doing stuff die for a PC to reroll. Probably going to pick a 6, but you know, whatever. And then we start getting into these things that have actual requirements. So at least one antagonist is alert, and you can spend 3 points. So you're mine. Pick an alert antagonist. All doing stuff rolls have minus 1d6 until they are desperate. So there's not a lot of time in here, but that, like, depending on how you're stepping things up, it could be like the whole game, basically. Um, then tell the boss, advance an antagonist until they are alert. So this just jumps to there. Um, then we have gotcha, a goblin is captured. So this is probably going to be like, this is clearly a goal. Um, so they don't succeed where they did. They lose all of their items and they're out of the scene. But then in the next scene, the PC proposes a small treasure. How does it help them escape? So then, for antagonist is desperate, sound the alarm. All antagonists step up to alert if they aren't already. This is a real Hail Mary kind of situation. If, like, you have, like, yeah, if the only thing you've been able to step up and you like really need access to tools, or to even get to the point where they can lose, then you could go, oh, my mook is desperate. I'm going to spend 4 and I'm going to get my guardian and my nemesis who are both like suspicious or oblivious, and they're just going to jump to alert, and I'm going to be able to do stuff here, or do this one in particular. Um, then Nemesis is alert is the requirement. And if you can get your Nemesis to be alert and then spend 5 points, it's over. All the goblins are captured. Um, so, yeah, a lot of, like, there are a lot of moving parts, but I'm hoping that it's relatively easy to figure out what you can and can't do. Um, Again, that's what playtests are for. So that's You Thievin Goblins. Um, I Yeah, I'm pretty proud of this. It's the first game I've like fully finished or like made into something I could publish if I wanted to, but I want to playtest it first, um, just to make sure there's like iron out the kinks or whatever. And if something look just truly doesn't be like going back to the drawing board, but I don't think that's going to happen. With the playtest, there's always like the balance. I So in my day job, I am a professional user experience researcher. So the playtesting aspect is actually very similar to a lot of the work that I do for my job. And therefore, I know what I would really want to do. But as my partner pointed out, there is no prize for best amateur playtest. Um, so am I gonna have a friend run it? Because the GM rules are so important to the what I want to test, and then have some other friends playing the creatures. I, you know, have the suggestion this is a 2 to 4 players game, but obviously you can ignore that. But I think that's probably where the numbers are going to work out best. And yeah, I probably will do another video at some point talking about playtesting, but I think this video is long enough, and thinking through your own work is also super useful. And hey, I got a bug in one of the lines by doing this. Yeah, if this was helpful to you, please, please, please comment, um, message me, whatever, um, share with anybody if it's useful. My goal is not to just like have a giant channel. Like, my goal is mainly to have a document of my own thinking. So, my name is Gabe Freeman. I'm working under Mind on Fire Games, and thank you for listening.